Welcome to part 3 of my how-to guide CB Performance Turbo and EFI kit. This is part 3. If you've not already seen, I've done a part 1 which is an unboxing video, and I've also done a part 2. In part 2 I talk about the header and the manifold, installation of the turbo, extended oil sump along with the oil lines, and what else? Oil cooler, the Mega Spark igniter box, as well as the Dizzy Blank. In this part I'm going to run you through how I did a charge cooler system on the turbo kit, as well as all the fuel lines. I'll then go into all the sensors that have gone onto the engine. I'll show you where to install your air pressure sensor and your cylinder head temperature sensor. I'll also go into detail where I've installed the actual EFI 4th Gen CB Performance box as well on the car, as well as the injectors, and hopefully go into detail in this video about how to fit the guide, and hopefully I'll have it running in the next video, which will be part 4. So I hope you enjoy it. If you haven't seen the first 2 videos, part 1 the unboxing and part 2, then I will put a link in the description below, and there'll also be a link in the description below of the complete build thread, which is on the Volkszone forum, which you can find on volkszone.com. If you are interested in having a look at that, I'll also put a link in the description at the bottom. So without further ado, we'll move on to part 3, and I'll show you how we can crack on with this CB Performance installation guide. You need to run a second return fuel line back to the tank. I use a 10mm or 3/8 copper pipe, which I ran under the car and installed near the centre tunnel. As you can see here, the instructions that come with the kit are pretty clear, and they give you a good guideline of how to set up the fuel lines. They come with all the pipe sizes that you need to use. The guide will tell you that you can't install the fuel regulator in the engine bay. You can ignore this and go ahead and fit it on the return side of the fuel line. So the best way to install the injectors is to first put a small amount of grease on the rubber seals and then gently push them into the fuel rails. The kit comes with a bracket that holds them in place. Then add a small amount of grease on the bottom seals and slowly push the whole assembly into the manifolds. The kit comes with these strange little mounting brackets that attach to the top of the manifolds where the throttle bodies go, but it does absolutely nothing. Now, I'm not 100% sure if I'm being stupid here, but I couldn't see the point of this bracket as it was about 10mm from the top of the fuel rail. There was nothing else in the kit to hold the top of the injectors down from what I could see, so I had to come up with a better way to secure the injectors onto the fuel rails down. So what I did was to modify the brackets by welding a nut to the bottom of them and then rounding off the edges so they fitted better and looked a little bit neater. Then after a little lick of paint, they looked okay, fitted perfectly, and they did the job of securing the fuel assembly down nicely. The fuel sensor fastens to the feed side of the fuel rail. The fuel comes in the fuel rail at the piston side 1 and 2. The fuel sensor is then secured to the outgoing feed of the fuel rail. The fuel line then moves across the face of the fan housing and into the fuel rail on piston side 3 and 4, and then back up to the fuel pressure regulator. As mentioned in the installation guide, it tells you not to install the fuel regulator in the engine bay. You can ignore this as they've now improved the regulator that comes in the kit, and you can easily just install it in the engine bay by securing it to the firewall. The regulator needs to be set at 45 psi, and then the fuel line then goes back to the return side of the tank. You need to add another port somewhere on your tank if you're using your original one. You can see here that fuel line B is my return feed back to the tank. Fuel line A is the main feed. So the fuel comes from the tank first into the filter, which is fuel line A, then goes into the fuel pump, which is mounted on the opposite side of the brake chamber on the chassis floor. It then goes out of the fuel pump and back into the main feed. You can also see on this picture the charge cooler pump, which is marked in yellow, and I'll go into that a little bit later. Right, that's it for the fuel lines. Next I'll show you where all the sensors go on the engine. I've already talked in part 2 about the O2 sensor, which fits into the exhaust tailpipe. If you've not seen part 2, I'll put a link in the description below. And again, I've already talked about the fuel sensor, which fits into the end of the fuel rail. The next two sensors are the air temperature sensor and the cylinder head temperature sensor. Sensor A, which is the one with the holes in it, as you can see there, is the air temperature sensor, and the temperature marked B, the B sensor, the one that's solid, is the head temperature sensor. Now, the air temperature sensor goes into the top pressure cover on the 3 and 4 cylinder side. You have to drill and tap the pressure cover using a 1/8 NPT thread, and then screw the air temperature sensor into the pressure cover. To install the cylinder head temperature sensor, you need to drill the head where the dimple goes, which is used to hold the old rocker cover spring clip. You'll need to remove your old rocker covers and holding springs and replace them with bolt-up rocker covers. Drill and tap using a 1/8 NPT thread and screw the head temperature sensor into the threaded hole you've made into the cylinder head. I use liquid PTFE to make sure I won't get any oil leakage from the sensor. And it goes without saying that you've got to remove your rocker assembly before you drill the hole, and then of course refit it again and redo your tappets. The pre-threaded hole in the middle of the pressure pipe is for the wastegate. Again, you need to use a 1/8 MPT connector and then fasten a silicone hose from this connector and down to your wastegate as shown. The additional pipe on the wastegate is just left open and vents into the atmosphere. Right, next I'll show you where I've mounted the ECU, go through the wiring loom, and also some panelling and a rear seat blank which I have made, which houses all the ECU really neatly. The wiring loom that comes with the kit is basically plug and play. All the connectors are named and marked up. They can be a bit fiddly, so just take your time and be careful when securing them to the sensors. You'll need to cut round about a 2" by 2" hole in your firewall to feed the wiring loom through. Now, I fitted the ECU under the rear seat, and it's essential that you use the rubber feet that come with the kit to mount the ECU. Don't just mount it straight to the floor because the vibrations of the car will kill it. There are 3 live wires that you need to connect straight to the batteries live, and 3 earth wires that must be earthed to the engine case. Everything is marked on the loom, so it's quite a straightforward job. I had some allied door panels also made and a rear seat blank by Donald Harvey over at DH Engineering in Scotland, which neatly finished everything off and hid the ECU nicely in the back. Right, next we'll move on to the fitment of the charge cooler, which was an absolute nightmare to get right. Now, CB don't sell a charge cooler kit, and for a good reason. It's a major pain to work out. First off, I had to work out the size of the radiator that I could get away with. I did this by making a cardboard template and checking that it would fit. I located the radiator on the front beam on the opposite side of the steering box. The radiator I ended up getting in the end, the radiator and fan, actually come from a quad bike. And it was the largest radiator I could get away with it without having to modify any of the front of the car. The blank from the opposite side of the steering box hole made a perfect access point to the top of the radiator, so I could easily top it up with water. The hole was also perfect to mount a 7-inch fan, which then blows cold air onto the radiator. Now, I had to do a lot of research and shopping around to find the right radiator and fan combination that would work and fit in the limited space that's available on the Volkswagen Beetle. Now, I don't want to modify the car too much, and I am trying my best to keep it looking as standard and as stock as possible, which is why I've gone for a small radiator with a fan and most things hidden, so it does look stock on the outside. The charge cooler pump is mounted in the same place as the fuel pump, and water comes from the radiator into the pump, runs out under the running boards, and then goes over the top of the gearbox and into the top of the charge cooler. It then runs back out of the bottom of the charge cooler through the pipe work and back into the top of the radiator. The pump that I used was a Bosch one. Now, I would like to get a little bit of a better flow in the system, as I feel the flow is a little bit too slow, so I may get a bigger pump or maybe even a secondary pump in the future. The water pipe does run quite close to the exhaust as well, so I bought some heat shield to protect it, to make sure that it wouldn't melt. I also put some of the heat shield across the oil lines that are quite close to the exhaust. But yeah, the charge cooler was a real head scratcher to work out and a massive pain in the bum, and depending on how it goes in testing, I may change the design of the whole system and possibly add a header tank at a later date. Okay, that's it for part 3. Stay tuned for part 4, where I'll show you the engine running, some of the software options, and I'll do a walk around, check and show off of the car and the turbo kit. I'll also be making a dyno video, which will be exciting, so make sure you stay tuned for that and much more. If you want to find out more about the Little Horus Drag Racing Beetle and anything else about the NDA drag racing team, I'll leave a link in the description of the video which will take you to the full build thread of the car.